Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to TRG 30. We're here Wednesday, June 24th. Another week has gone by and we're so pleased to have you all with us here again today. A reminder, we'll follow up after today with a copy of today's webinar, and also we'll be asking for your feedback, which we read in depth every single week. Thank you for joining us again. And as always, our CEO, Jill Robinson, is here today to take us through the next 30 minutes. Hi, Jill.
Hi, Stephen, and thank you everyone for joining us again today. TRG 30 with you every week, listening to you, and today's content is in fact a direct tie to the listening we've been doing to your questions in TRG 30 and during our Executive Recovery Summits. Workplace culture during this time is something that we have heard is of interest to you, so here we are today. Get there in a moment. Always moving forward now, at least in the near future, we will be tying our content to the 7 new ways that I introduced a couple of weeks ago that we see as bold change that we can be making in the sector that will help our resilience through arguably some of the most challenging times, but also times full of opportunity. Today, as I said, we're going to be talking about workplace culture. And I am pleased to be joined today by Jason Rosoff, who is the co-founder and CEO of Radical Candor. At the end of last year, we announced a book club, in fact, that I planned on doing with a group of some of you in this room about Kim Scott's book, Radical Candor, and invited Radical Candor and Jason to join us to talk about workplace culture. Jason, you have helped teams at companies large and small through your consulting firm, Radical Candor. And before that, you were so interestingly, for almost a decade at Khan Academy, scaling that educational institution for, 100 million students and teachers. You were both the chief people officer and the chief product officer, working in partnership with the Gates Foundation and Google. And I am just so pleased to have you join us today as someone who thinks always and has for a long time thought about workplace culture. Welcome to you, and thank you for being with us here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share a little bit about Radical Candor and hopefully answer some questions in a helpful way.
Yeah, so let's start with Radical Candor. Some people in our virtual space today will have read Kim's book, but certainly not all. Can you just define for us Radical Candor to start us off?
Yeah, so Radical Candor in its simplest form is a framework, a way to think about the kinds of relationships and by extension, the kinds of interactions that we want to have with people. Kim's goal in writing the book originally was she wanted to stop what she saw as a false dichotomy from existing in the workplace, which was she often felt, and I think many leaders often feel, like I can either be kind or I can be effective. Like they feel like mutually exclusive choices sometimes. Yeah. And I think we know, experienced leaders know that that's not true. In fact, in our best moments, we're combining both of those things, right? We're leading, I don't know if you know, like the heart, the head, and the hands model, right? We're leading with all 3 of those things simultaneously. And so we need to be able to combine those things. And that's the root of Radical Candor. So the 2x2 that you see in front of you is a representation of not just what Radical Candor is, but what it's not. So you have care personally on the vertical axis and challenge directly on the horizontal axis. And when you combine both of those things, you achieve Radical Candor. But it's also important to recognize like what happens when we fail to combine those things. And that's what those other quadrants are about. So when we challenge directly, but we fail to show that we care, we call that obnoxious aggression. This might also be known as brutal honesty. And I think the reason why we call this out is that it's not that the information doesn't pass from person to person, right? The challenge directly is there, but because the care personally isn't there, we often are demotivated to actually follow through. We feel put down or less than as a result of receiving that. And then we have on the other side of the framework, we have where we fail to challenge directly or to care personally. We call that manipulative insincerity. And the image shows you someone stabbing someone else in the back. And that's like the worst possible version of this. But a much more common version that shows up in our day-to-day experience would be passive aggressive behavior. Right? Where you're not really saying what you mean and you're not showing that you care about this person. And that, as we know, is the source of a lot of degradation in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And then last but not least, we have this quadrant where you do deeply care, but you fail to challenge yourself or other people directly. And we call this ruinous empathy. And I think especially in the arts and in mission-driven organizations, the desire to care is very high. Like the care personally tends to be very high in those organizations. But we don't necessarily recognize the disastrous consequences that it can have of withholding information from somebody that they really need to get in order to be successful, or that you, or people withholding that information from you as a leader, I think is especially damaging. There's a lot of ruinous empathy towards leaders, withholding that information from you, which prevents you from being the leader that you need to be successful. So
yes. So Jason, I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, the reason that the book was so interesting to me was about these realities, but also just the orientation around best practices in workplace culture. So
yeah, absolutely.
The book and your organization suggests that it may be, you might think it's just simply about how do we deliver and receive feedback. It's much bigger than that, but you're right. In mission-driven organizations where people care deeply about each other's care about the mission, that ruinous empathy, as you call it, is something that we see, but we see all of the quadrants. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that description. And now let's put that context and the context of managing workplace culture in the reality that we face today, which has included, of course, this sector that we are in was one of the first affected, likely to be one of the last to really resume fully. So that's existentially challenging. We all have elevated rightly the discussion about racism. We are working remotely and recently in the UK, which you know our audience here is an international one, but also in the US, the economic stimulus that has been afforded to people through government packages is soon to end or likely to end. And so hard conversations are being had right now on top of what have been hard conversations. So how in the midst of this, how does radical candor and the things that you teach apply, and why culture when we're existentially threatened? Why prioritize culture now as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, obviously a complex question, and I'll try to answer as succinctly as I can. But first, I just want to say, like, I empathize. You know, most of our work was live in-person training events, so our work has also been completely upended by the changing circumstances. I know this kind of transformation is really hard, and I think what I heard you say at the beginning, like this idea of resilience, like what creates resiliency in organizations, feels to me to be so fundamentally related to culture as to be inseparable. And the reason why I think that is when I think about what organizations are capable of, there are a couple of guiding lights, right? One of them is the goals and the mission of the organization, which says, here's what we're trying to accomplish in the world. And the other guiding light is, here are the ways that we work together and how we think about getting that done. And to me, the way we work together and how we think about accomplishing our mission, that is culture. That's what culture is. That's the meaningful impact of culture on the work. There's another impact of culture, which is like how I feel as a team member, right? How connected I feel to other people on the team. And so from my perspective, the reason to focus on culture is because you're going to be necessarily wrong. Your mission may not change, but your goals are certainly going to change in this moment. And you're going to get those wrong. And so the whole idea of like, what helps us? How do we become resilient? What helps you is having clarity on why those goals were set, and then having a really great operating system, which is essentially what culture is, operating system for getting those things done, so that your team collectively feels included and capable of contributing meaningfully to updating and changing what you are doing on a day-to-day basis. And so to the extent that your culture excludes people from that, that's a huge loss for you. And it can exclude because there may be like racist elements to your culture. And I think the more we learn about structural racism, the more we realize like that's just a fact. Like because we are steeped in because our broad cultures are racist, like our organizational cultures reflect those unless we actively work against it. Same thing with other forms of oppression, sexism, ableism, homophobia, et cetera. And on top of that, even if those things are good, but there's a lot of exercising of sort of structural power in your organization, right? Like, and this is an issue in the arts in particular, right? Because the role of director, for example, there's a lot of power in that person.
You bet, you bet.
And when you exercise that power in a way that makes people's ideas feel unwelcome, regardless of whether it has anything to do with like societal oppression, that also excludes people. And so that's where a culture matters, because like anything that you're doing to stop people from contributing is going to get in the way of your long-term success.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, so a friend of mine, Don Roth, runs the Mondavi Center at UC Davis, and he was in a summit with me recently and said, Jill, you know, this Zoom culture, it's super interesting. It's flattened out the hierarchy a little. I, as a leader, I'm connecting in different ways with different people, and he was reflecting on that so positively. I feel similarly in a culture that is working really hard to flatten anyway, but it resonated a whole lot to me. What also resonates with me is this concept that you just advanced about culture as the operating system. That is a frame that I think a lot of people could latch onto. So if you think about that, you're a leader right now in an organization, and you want to get the best operating system you can, have the best culture you can in this 2D kind of stressed environment that we're in. What are a couple, 3 things that a leader could do to make it happen, to improve the operating system?
Yeah, so I think one, all of these things relate to making the system visible. So I think often what happens in organizations is they don't even have a description of what they want that operating system to be. They haven't written it down anywhere. Some organizations, so like it starts with saying, we're going to describe this thing. We're going to make visible this thing that has been invisible. And that's not something that leaders should do on their own. I feel like it's actually essential to do that in collaboration with your team members. Second, if you do have a description somewhere, I think you need to make sure that description is accurate. So often what will happen is Radical Candor will work with organizations that say, we're an organization that values feedback. And the reason they're hiring us is because no one's giving anyone feedback. That's written in their values, right? It's like part of the operating instructions, but it's not actually happening. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing that you can do is like, once you have a description that you feel like is relatively accurate, you can actually evaluate whether or not that culture is set up to achieve what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I would argue that in this moment, you know, one of the most important goals that most organizations can have but have not written down is the ability to adapt quickly to new information. We want to evaluate ourselves on how quickly we can change when we get new information. And that goal in and of itself suggests an entire set of operating system changes that you would have to make, because the 2D thing helps, right? Like it helps because it gives leaders an opportunity to interact with more people. But something I've noticed about Zoom, just like I noticed about meetings, is like we do have the same structural problems of like, who's speaking up? Mm-hmm. How often are we checking in with people? Like, is there someone being quiet in the room? And why are they being quiet? Like, all of those things still exist. And my guess is like the way that you see those problems present themselves when you can't respond quickly. So like evaluating that often creates pressure to create a more inclusive cultural environment.
When I was preparing for the book club, that I don't think I said we had to cancel because literally the participants, theaters were closing down on the day of the book club. But in preparation for it, I talked to Kim briefly, and said this framework of radical candor encourages people to be courageous and deal with fear. And I was musing with her about how that might help us in a variety of conversations that little did I know we'd be facing as a field, as humans today. And so we've talked about this, you and I, a little bit, this notion that fear and doesn't, becomes a wall sort of to the kind of conversation that creates the operating system that we need. Mm-hmm. But I was curious about anything that you would want to say about that, but also the segue before I suspect Stephen will join us, and we do want to hear the questions that have come in from the group in advance. But even as it relates to customers, you know, we're having interestingly potent conversations if we're smart internally, but can that apply externally? So can you just riff on those couple of things for a minute?
Sure. So I think the way that I think about this is when our fight for survival, when we are fighting for survival, when existence is the thing, like as organizations, which like another word for organization is community. As communities, when we're like fighting for survival, it can be very tempting to become very insular, to look inwards for all of the answers. But my experience as a leader is that my most interesting moves came at the boundaries. They came at the intersection of two disciplines. When I started so my background is product and people, like I took what I learned about creating products into my work as chief people officer, because I thought, like, why aren't we designing the experience of employees? Why aren't we as intentionally designing the experience of employees as we are designing the experience of, in your case, audience members, or in my case, users of a product? Like, why isn't that the thing that we're doing? And that gave me a lens that changed the way that we talked about people operations, classic HR, hiring, et cetera. And I think there's a huge opportunity there, both internally and externally. So like, there are people who are not in your industry who have gone through similar transformations, who may have very interesting points of view. There are customers who would probably be willing to engage with your organization, your community in very new ways, and they have great ideas, but we're so afraid to admit that we don't know, like that we don't have the answer, that we often don't reach out and talk to them. And I think like in your case, that I think that there's an existential nature to that in this moment, because like, what is it even going to look like to reopen theaters, and who has that expertise? Like, some of it's going to come from public health experts, but audiences may have really, you know what I'm saying? Like, and patrons may have really interesting ideas for how to do that.
Totally. And the question that we're beginning to ask the field, that the field has been grappling with whom will we gather?
Yeah.
You know, we have in our sector, we have traditional audiences that look like the faces on this screen. Mm-hmm. And as we look to expand our relevance and impact and relationship with our communities, it's going to require radical conversations and courage, and this pushing past fear piece, I feel like, is really important, and I suspect will come up in the questions that I know, Stephen, that you have for us that come directly from our
excellent questions coming in. I would just say, so we can fit in 10 minutes as always. If you want to submit any more, you know the place to do it. Thanks to those that submitted questions in advance, and Jamie cuts to the nub of several questions here, Jason, which are around some tactical steps right now that leaders or team members can take to improve their workplace culture.
Yeah, so I think in addition to what I mentioned when Jill asked this question earlier, which is like, you can't fix what you can't see. I think that that's a lot of the conversation about racism, sexism, homophobia. Also, like, we can't fix what we can't see, and like the question in my mind is, if you don't have your finger on, as a leader, if you don't feel like you have your finger directly on the pulse of the experience of your team members, the question is like, why can't you, like, why don't you, why can't you see it? Like, what is motivating you to be maybe strategically ignorant of what that experience actually is? So it starts there. I think the second thing that people can do is they can look to example organizations out there that are much more similarly structured. So like, my guess is that a lot of arts companies are modeled on things that happened fairly long in the past. And Jill, to your point, like, things are changing, both like the 2D structure of organizations, as well as like who the audiences are and how we're going to engage with them. But there are other organizations out there who have done this. And you can look at both sort of like social justice organizations who have very deep ties to community and community organization, as well as to technology organizations who have democratized to some extent the access that people have to the way they work, right? Twitter announced that they're going to allow people to work from home forever. And so this question of like, how can we push ourselves to find exemplars out there that push us further out of our comfort zone?
Yep. Jason, what I like about this, and actually I was going to ask you to take a step further on the tactics, because, you know, you might be reduced to one person or 3 or 5 right now.
Yep.
So you've just identified some simple, cheap, as I call them, cheap and cheerful,
Yeah.
cheap and cheerful things that one can do. You can look. You could, it sounds like you could ask your team members that are still with you to feed to you about what they perceive culture to be, so that you can reconcile it. I do want to move to next questions, but you know, this group is, the world is operating with smaller staff teams, and so knowing what to do nimbly and inexpensively feels really important right now.
This question has come up on previous TRG 30 sessions. Jill, we hear this a lot. Jason, you might not be surprised by this question. Libby asks, how can team members advocate for culture-related conversations at their workplace where leadership is opaque and not openly communicative?
Yeah, that is a question which I think there may be a better answer to in this moment than there is typically, because one of the biggest fears that people have of coming forward is that they could be fired or something for like pushing for these conversations. My guess is that like a lot of that is out of control and has very little to do with like whether or not we're having cultural conversations. So there's like a value, there's a moment in this context where like organizations are making these reductions anyway. And so I think that this idea of speaking out becomes more accessible, because it's not necessarily going to be the thing that decides whether or not you are the person who gets to stick around, right? In many cases, it's like this question of redundancy that's going to determine that. So there may be an opportunity in this moment. I would say in general, one of the ways that I've seen be successful is like to actually start by sharing your experience, maybe one-on-one. So sometimes it's tempting to try to boil the ocean, to like pick the biggest problem that you have and try to address that. But maybe there's a small example that you have of like, hey, in that meeting, like I really felt like my input wasn't included. Like there were a couple of times where I tried to speak up and I didn't feel like I had the opportunity. Like that smaller issue might open the door for a bigger conversation. And I found that often to be really, really helpful, including for me. Like I've had people come to me and say like, you may not be aware of this, but and that's the start. And they say like, oh, but and actually I've noticed that this is a pattern, like other people are experiencing this thing also. So that hopefully that's helpful. I just want to recognize that it's really hard, and this has to be a partnership. Like I don't think there is any version of this where an individual contributor in an organization can revolutionize the culture. Like That unfortunately that's not how culture change works. Like if there is no collaboration with leadership, like culture change is going to be very, very difficult or near impossible. So the question is like, how do we start those conversations, and can we start small?
I would say, though, that you hit the nail on the head when you said in arts and culture, there are often directors, curators, people with a great deal of power. And I like the suggestion that you've made, pushing past the fear to initiate a conversation. It's hard to do. Radical Candor talks about the ways in which that can happen. So I would recommend the read for sure from that vantage point. But sometimes leaders aren't aware, and there's immense power in people with courage and inspiration to create change. I've been the recipient of it. Jill, you're not aware. Sometimes you're just not aware.
Yep.
I think taking action today, the world is open to all kinds of different conversations. I don't mean to be naive about it, but we should seize the opportunity. Stephen, I'll give you the mic back.
There's several anonymous questions, and I think it's the theme of the questions. I acknowledge that. I'm interested in the toxic empathy side of things. We have hard decisions to make and then to communicate. I'm finding I'm having to repeat the harsh facts again and again in a Groundhog Day scenario, because not everyone can keep a grasp on the vastness of the change, or they can't bear to break bad news to people they empathize with. We talked a little bit about that before we started today, didn't we?
Yeah, I think we need to have this is why Radical Candor is so helpful, because if we say like, look, another way to say care personally would be to like be of service, to be of help to somebody else, right? I think that's one of the most fundamental ways that human beings show that they care about other human beings, is to make themselves in service. And I think we need to question what service looks like. One of the most important things about really challenging decisions and difficult times, and where context is changing frequently, it is like, one of the kindest things that you can do is to be transparent about those things. And I know it can be really painful especially as a leader, to feel like you have to repeat these things over and over again. And yet I think the more that we can push ourselves to share information, to treat the other people on our team as adults, the better we are going to be of service to them, because they need to make their own decisions, right? They need to be able to make their own decisions for themselves and their family about how they need to operate in this moment as well. And that can be a partnership, like where you're sharing information and having open conversation about it, or it can be happening sort of behind closed doors, where both parties are poorer as a result. They're making worse decisions as a result.
This notion of information sharing as service, it's different language. It's super helpful, Jason, actually, this reframing of it and treating people like adults resonates a lot right now. We owe it to people to be candid right now, don't we? Do we have time for one more before we wrap?
We go for a 60-second.
Yeah, okay.
So
okay.
Let's go around a theme, which talks more about overcoming communications when working virtually, and how long we may be working differently, perhaps forever in some ways, right? There's so many questions around this theme, but are there any final tips that you would give around virtual working right now?
Yes. So I think two things. One, try to have more frequent, shorter interactions with people. I think in a world where we had lots of casual interactions, meeting with people once a week might have been enough to tie those in a knot. If you're not having more regular check-ins with people, you're probably missing out on a lot of context, because so much of what's happening is invisible. So that's tip number one. And tip number two is like, create some time for non-work interaction, even virtually. Like Kim likes to talk about having tea with somebody, but have a physical tea. Like both of you have a tea at the same time while on Zoom. Like these kinds of things can help facilitate real connection, to like simulate some of what we would get if we were doing those things in person.
Thank you so much, Jason. We will find ways to answer the rest of your questions, as always, on our LinkedIn virtual network. You can find more information in the follow-up email. Jill, would you share a little bit about what's coming up over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, first of all, a big thank you to you, Jason. Just really, really useful to hear both Kim through the book and you as her partner frame some of these really important issues. And I am, as you all heard me say, committed to responding as I can to questions that you ask or get them answered for you. So we will be doing that. The 7 new ways, we're trying to thread them. Next week, we will be talking about how we listen to our audiences. And to Jason's point, that is not only about how we listen to current audiences and inspire them to help us become something new right now, but also how we listen to new members of our community. We have to listen. We can't assume that the things we think, the things we want, the ways we do it today will work in the future. We've got to have a direct line to them. That's next week with our colleagues at the Arts Club Theatre Company in Vancouver and Sheffield Theatres in England. You can see after that, we've got innovation with artists at the center, with Kwame, who's at the Young Vic in England, and Dr. Tony Byers, who wrote The Multiplier Effect of Inclusion, will be joining us later in the month. Thank you so much for choosing to spend 30 minutes with us today. As always, we're rooting for you, for your resilience. May the force be with you. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye, everyone.